course, the child goes to the teacher who will guide that child.
What do you mean by external moral authority? You use that expression a lot.
Materialism has to do with when you are
Hello, it's great to have all of you back here in the studio with us for the course in Values and Spirituality. In this episode, we will be looking at changes in perception as well as taking personal responsibility. Sister Denise, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
The first question I have for you is what is meant by the first two lines of this paragraph? The quality and nature of your perception change as you develop your spirituality. How do you perceive and what is the basis of your perception? I'd like to read the rest because it's relevant to the answer. Most people believe that they interpret objectively what the five senses tell them about external reality. In fact, your perception is greatly affected and often limited by your cultural filters. What do you mean by these words, and tell us how one's perception changes? And when it comes to cultural filters, how do they block or increase our perception?
You see, there is a scripture in India that talks about perception, and that's the Gita. Perception, who perceives? You perceive. You perceive a visual phenomena through your eyes. If you say your eyes perceive, then whatever your eyes can see, that's what's there. But if you say no, it is the inner self who perceives visual phenomena through the eyes, that means you're going to decide what you're going to look at. One thing is seeing, and the other is looking. One thing is hearing, the other is listening. And we have different words for where we focus our attention. As you develop your spirituality, you become much more sensitive and aware that I'm seeing, what I want to see. And I don't see what I don't want to see. Or sometimes you will see something and the mind is where that perception lands. And depending on your state of mind is how you're going to interpret that perception. That means our cultural belief that sense perception is objective is quite erroneous. It's only true if all there is a body. But since in the practice of spirituality we have to take into consideration that the one who perceives is the spirit, the sense organ is the instrument of perception, and then what do you focus your eyes on? Or if you're listening, it's the ears. What do you listen to? If you think about a normal scene from the world, somebody talking in a room, the sounds of fans, traffic, somebody in another room, there's all kinds of sounds, and you choose what you're going to listen to. And if some very strong sound comes out of the side, your attention will shift there, and you will decide, do I need to pay attention on this? Do I figure out that it's not something I need to work on, and then come back to what I was perceiving, what I was focusing my attention on, and then you will miss something in between as well.
You mentioned body consciousness and soul consciousness in previous episodes. How does that play out in what you just said?
Body consciousness and soul consciousness very much an attribute of how you work your mind, or how you work with your mind. Any sense perception that comes into you lands on the screen of your mind. So you have visual recording, auditory recording, there may be fragrance, and then your mind accepts all these things, and it goes to your intelligence for interpretation. Depending on your level of consciousness, your intelligence will interpret it from spiritual considerations or from materialistic considerations, using this value filter or that value filter, or in terms of the philosophy of karma. So there's a lot of deciding that happens very, very quickly. So as you develop your spirituality, you become much more able to take responsibility for the decisions, and you're much less under the influence of your mind, which is a very powerful instrument. And usually people are absolutely dictated to by what they see and hear, and they filter it by their preconceptions rather than sitting with their intelligence and saying, okay, here is this thing, these are my preconceptions, now what do I think? You know, and that takes time, but as you develop your spiritual capacity, it all comes very quickly.
You say at the end of page 27, you are colored by your emotional responses and preconceptions, which distort to a greater or lesser extent that which you perceive through your five senses. Does that mean whatever baggage we're carrying affects that which we see?
It becomes a filter.
Sister Denise, could you give us a practical example? I'm thinking of the issue of racism, for example. If you see somebody of a particular color, shade of color, that you and it's not that you have something against that particular person because you don't even know him or her. You have something against somebody of that color, you will automatically have negative feelings towards that person. That person could be completely innocent of anything that you may be accusing him of in your mind. Is that what you mean?
You have glasses with a color correction on it, you can say.
Yeah.
There are some people, they just don't see body color. Other people, they only see body color. And so because your preconception about body color, race, ethnicity, etc., is very high in your value system, and you evaluate people according to their body color, the language they speak, their class, whatever it is. So you see somebody of a particular body color and you put them in a category without evaluating other considerations, and that is called prejudice. You have judged it before you're looking at the considerations. That's the meaning of prejudice. So that means that you don't judge it on its merits, or you don't look at the person as who they are or what they are. And this is the filter.
I do like the note in which you continue the subject. Through practicing meditation, you will gradually reduce these filters and become more tolerant and accommodating. In other words, you move your vision and your sense perceptions from superficiality to reality.
You see, in body consciousness, your eyes stop at the surface of the body. In soul consciousness, you go right through the body to the person who lies within that body. And so, yes, body consciousness shows you only the surface. So that is superficial. And soul consciousness, as you develop it, you start to look for much more subtle indicators, and you disregard things that need to be disregarded, but that previously you thought was the most important thing. So your whole relationship with filters changes, and some filters you might just completely take them down and say, you know, let me be colorblind. Why do I need to evaluate a person on the basis of their body color when it doesn't prove or disprove anything?
What strikes me as I listen to you speak is that we tend to be very loyal to our preconceptions, to our own personality. And what this course does is that it invites us to think in an entirely different way.
It does, absolutely. And why we get these preconceptions is because we're raised with them. And so the external moral authorities, particularly parents, you know, if you're raised in a racist family and you're not racist, they're going to penalize you for that very quickly. And they're going to be able to represent the position of racism much more effectively than you will be able to say, oh, but it doesn't seem right.
Okay, so I now want to go on to the next subject, which is taking personal responsibility. It is found on page 28 of our textbook. As your perception changes, so do your priorities. That's an interesting note in which to start this paragraph. What does that mean?
You shift your focus of attention, and you also start using your instruments of perception, your organs of perception, differently. You select information that comes from them also differently. Your criteria change. What's important changes. That means your values are changing. And what that means is that some set of priorities that you started off with, perhaps before you started this course, as you evaluate yourself and you evaluate things in terms of the information that's coming, you get insights. That means the way you look at something means something differently to what it meant before you looked at it or when you looked at it previously. Your standards change. There's like a dial with very good over here and very bad over there, and then there's a line which divides good and bad. You're going to change the position of that line on the dial as your priorities change.
You go on to say that in every crisis lies the hidden benefit of golden opportunities. I'm thinking of the scenarios in which people actually take sorrow from their circumstances or something that happens to them, where you experience deep pain and sorrow, so you become blinded by your pain and sorrow, and you either cannot see or refuse to see. What do you call golden opportunities?
This brings to mind a phenomenon called tough love.
Okay, tell us more.
You know, when somebody's behavior is antisocial or they become addicted or something like this, the people around that person need to assertively keep them in line. And very often a person who is being antisocial will say, well, if you're a good person, you will let me do whatever I want, and only bad people keep me in line. And you will say, I love you very much, and that's why I'm going to keep you in line. And the person will feel really bad about it and assume that your so-called love is actually hatred, but it's actually a golden opportunity for you to start to have proper parameters in your life, boundaries in your life, and become sensitive to some behavior that you think is actually very good because you like it, but then you realize it's harmful for you. And then what's harmful for you starts to become what you dislike, and what's good for you starts to become also what you like. So it's shifting.
I really enjoyed what you said at the bottom of page 28. Since the 1960s, extensive research conducted into therapeutic modalities has found psychological and spiritual solutions to many of today's social problems, including violent crime. Earlier in this section, you also mentioned how Alcoholics Anonymous has started. That's a really lovely story. So would you take us through this, how therapeutic modalities has found psychological and spiritual solutions to the problems?
It's quite a complex matter, and normally it is felt that anything to do with therapy has to be limited to and confined to the medical profession and people who are properly trained in it. But there is the phenomenon of self-help groups. And this is because there are far, far more people who are in trouble than psychotherapists and psychologists to go around to help them. And so Alcoholics Anonymous is an example of the approach of addicts, alcoholics, getting together and applying spiritual principles and certain rules and practices and exercises to get the addict to become honest. Because honesty is a key element. When you're an addict, you're very often in denial. And that means that you lie to yourself and everybody else about your situation. When you are deviant in other ways, there's very often this aspect of denial. And maybe you get into a criminal activity and then you get punished, but your psychological problem or your trauma never gets addressed because it's too hard, it's too expensive, there's nobody around, whatever. But especially I think during the 80s and 90s, there were a lot of people very focused on trying to help these situations. And so there are many books are written. And it means now that the material that is normally limited to professionals is actually out there, and you can study it and do fairly well, get a fairly good working knowledge as a layman, and it can be enough to help you and your loved ones and people in your community to get across some of these big humps when there isn't a therapist available, or you don't want to spend the money for it or whatever. You see?
You go on to say that offenders are educated in values and learn meditation through which their inner hurt is gradually healed. That is actually quite beautiful.
I mean, not all offenders have that luxury, but it's beginning to come into the facilities, and those offenders who recognize that they do have big internal issues are starting to take advantage of what's out there and do the work, you know. And in many ways, a spiritual practice can only really be done once you've done your psychological work. So when people start a spiritual practice, they very often come across areas of their personality where there are psychological issues, and they're blocked in their continued spiritual work until they've dealt with the psychological stuff. So a lot of the spiritual practice includes some of the psychological work that helps a person to get forward, and it's all to do with clarity and honesty and facing who you are and what you've done and why you did it, and do you want to carry on.
You do mention accountability at some stage, which is what the point of the exercise is, isn't it? That's where the aspect of taking personal responsibility comes in.
Yes, exactly.
Is it a question of an individual believing, this didn't happen to me, I was an active participant in what occurred in my life?
Yes, or I was an observer. You see, it's only recently that people have recognized the issue of secondary trauma. You see, so a child watching the parents engaged in brutal, violent combat is not neutral, is totally affected by that. But because nobody mentions it or addresses it, they think it doesn't do anything. But now they realize it does a lot, and it can make the difference between whether or not that child does well at school, whether or not that child is able to form good relationships, you see. So all of these things are now known, and they're out in the regular conversations of people. It's general knowledge as opposed to limited professional knowledge.
We are now seeing sound and refined practices of spirituality applied in individual and social life. In modern Indian cities and in Western countries, it is becoming common for people from all walks of life to include meditation as part of their routine. So this is now an internationally accepted tool of self-healing.
I have watched this shift over the past 40, 50 years, and at the beginning people thought meditation was definitely bad and only strange people do it and it's dangerous and things like this. But gradually, because of such an accumulation of benefit and because nothing bad happened, it's getting into the mainstream, and that is changing the social attitudes. But these things take time for the general public to get used to feel confident in, and then to say, okay, yeah, this is normal.
I enjoyed your use of terminology here. Conventional religions are also looking into their own vaults. I like that a lot. For forgotten mystical teachings and spiritual symbology, and making them available to their congregations who are seeking more spiritual sustenance. What led you to say that?
Well, you see, what started happening is the religious edifices and organizations started losing people. I think during the time of the 1920s, where science came up, the 1930s, where there was this existentialist crisis, where it was announced that God is dead, and World War II happened, and there was a terrible human, social and historical catastrophe, and life as we knew it became drastically changed. People felt viscerally that the institutions, including the religious institutions, had failed them. And then what happened is people started traveling and looking to other cultures and finding things that were very exciting, very interesting, and meditation was one of them. Because usually meditation is associated with India, with Asia. The martial arts became something that became popular, and then the churches and synagogues and so on got empty. And the leaders had to really take a deep look and see that how are we failing our congregations, and what do we have to do to retain them. And this is where they started to look into the very powerful mystical traditions that exist in Judaism and Christianity, very powerful, but they had just fallen by the wayside because they weren't considered by the elders to be important. But with this change, they found that they had to look at that, and they found they had a very rich resource, and so a lot of people said, oh, I can continue with my religion and receive powerful spiritual sustenance. So that change is continuing to take place, and it's pretty much in the mainstream now. No one.
Well, that is a very powerful note on which to end today's show, so thank you very much.
Thank you.
And thank you for joining us. I do hope we get to see you again for the next episode. Take care and goodbye.